The world didn't just admire Elvis Presley, they worshipped him. To millions, he wasn't just a singer, he was a symbol of perfection, a man who seemed to have everything anyone could ever dream of. The stage lights followed his every move. Fans screamed his name as if he were something beyond human, and every song he sang felt like magic. From the outside, his life looked untouchable. Fame, wealth, power, and admiration surrounded him like a golden shield. But what the world saw was only a carefully lit stage, and behind that stage, shadows quietly grew. As the years passed, those shadows deepened, but no one really wanted to look closely enough to notice. The world was too busy celebrating the king to question what it cost him to wear that crown. As a young girl growing up in that world, Lisa Marie saw something very different. While millions envied her life, believing she was the luckiest child in the world, she was quietly witnessing a reality that didn't match the image people adored. Inside the walls of Graceland, life was not always glamorous. There were moments of silence that felt too heavy, rooms that echoed with absence rather than joy, and a father who, despite being surrounded by people, often seemed completely alone. Lisa Marie didn't see a perfect icon. She saw a man trying to hold himself together under the crushing weight of expectations. She saw the long nights, the exhaustion hidden behind smiles, and the pressure that never seemed to fade. The world saw confidence, but she saw vulnerability. The world saw control, but she saw struggle. And the most heartbreaking part was that no one outside those walls seemed to realize it. As Elvis's fame continued to rise, so did the demands placed on him. Every performance had to be bigger than the last. Every appearance had to live up to the legend people believed in. There was no room for weakness, no space to simply be human. The world didn't want Elvis the man. They wanted Elvis the myth. And slowly, that expectation began to take its toll. Lisa Marie would later reveal how this constant pressure created a quiet storm in his life. It wasn't something that exploded all at once. It was something that built over time, piece by piece, moment by moment. The kind of struggle that doesn't always show on stage, but lives in the spaces between. She remembered moments where he seemed distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't share. Moments where the energy he gave to the world left him with nothing for himself. And yet, whenever the spotlight turned on, he transformed. He became exactly what everyone expected him to be. That was the illusion the world fell in love with. But illusions don't last forever. What made Lisa Marie's perspective so powerful was that she wasn't looking from the outside. She was living inside the truth. She saw how fame created a barrier between Elvis and reality. People around him often told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to hear. The louder the applause became, the quieter the honesty around him grew. And in that silence, important truths were lost. Lisa Marie would later explain how difficult it was to understand all of this as a child. She loved her father deeply, but even she could sense that something wasn't right. There were emotional distances that couldn't be explained, moments of connection followed by sudden withdrawal. It was confusing, painful, and at times isolating. While the world celebrated him, she was trying to understand him. And as she grew older, those memories began to form a clearer picture, one that didn't match the perfect image the world still held onto. What the fans missed wasn't just the struggles themselves, but the signs of those struggles. They were there, hidden in plain sight. The exhaustion, the changes in behavior, the subtle shifts that hinted at something deeper. But people didn't want to see those signs. It was easier to believe in the legend than to question it. It was easier to celebrate than to confront the possibility that their idol was hurting. Lisa Marie's revelations would later challenge that perspective. She spoke not to tear down his legacy, but to humanize it, to show that behind the fame was a real person with real emotions, real pain, and real challenges. She wanted the world to understand that being loved by millions doesn't protect you from loneliness, that having everything doesn't mean you feel complete, that sometimes the brightest lights create the darkest shadows. Her words carried a weight that fans couldn't ignore. For the first time, many began to see Elvis not just as the king, but as a man who carried a burden most people could never fully understand. It forced people to rethink everything they believed about his life. The image they had held onto for so long started to crack, revealing something far more complex underneath. And yet, in that complexity, there was something even more powerful. Because when the illusion faded, what remained was not disappointment, it was truth. And that truth made his story even more meaningful. It showed that greatness doesn't come without struggle, that even those who seem larger than life are still human at their core. Lisa Marie didn't just reveal what the world missed, she revealed what made him real. And in doing so, she gave people a chance to see him in a way they never had before. Not just as a legend, but as a father, a person, and a man who gave everything he had to a world that never fully understood him. As the world continued to celebrate Elvis Presley as an untouchable legend, the reality inside his personal life grew more complicated with each passing year. Fame didn't just surround him, it consumed him. Every decision, every movement, every moment of his life was influenced by the expectations of millions. What once felt like a dream slowly began to feel like a responsibility he could never escape. And while fans saw the glamour, the music, and the charisma, they didn't see the weight that came with it. For Lisa Marie Presley, this wasn't something she read about or heard in stories. This was her everyday life. Growing up inside Graceland, she witnessed how fame created distance, not just between Elvis and the world, but even within his closest relationships. There were moments when the house felt full of people, yet strangely empty at the same time. Assistants, friends, and staff were always around, but genuine connection was often missing. The louder the outside world became, the quieter things felt inside. Lisa Marie began to notice how her father struggled to find peace in his own space. Even at home, where he was supposed to feel safe, the pressure followed him. There was no real escape from being Elvis Presley. He couldn't simply step outside without attention, couldn't live a normal life without being watched, and couldn't show weakness without risking the image people had built around him. That constant need to maintain perfection started to blur the line between who he was and who the world expected him to be. Over time, that pressure began to change him in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Lisa Marie would later reflect on how those changes affected their relationship. There were days when he was warm, present, and full of life, the father she adored. But there were also days when he seemed distant, almost unreachable, as if he were carrying something too heavy to share. As a child, she didn't fully understand why those shifts happened. She only knew that the man the world celebrated wasn't always the same man she saw at home. The contrast was confusing, even heartbreaking at times. She loved him deeply, but she could sense that something was pulling him away. One of the most difficult realities was how isolated he became, despite being surrounded by people. Fame has a way of building walls, and for Elvis, those walls grew higher over time. The people around him often protected his image rather than his well-being. They ensured the show went on, that appearances were maintained, that the legend remained intact. But in doing so, they sometimes ignored the deeper issues he was facing. Lisa Marie would later reveal that this environment made it harder for him to confront his struggles openly. When everyone treats you like a king, it becomes difficult to admit that you're struggling. When the world expects strength, showing vulnerability can feel impossible. And so, much of what he was dealing with stayed hidden, even from those closest to him. As the years went on, the gap between the public image and private reality continued to widen. Fans still saw the electrifying performer, the confident icon, the man who seemed to control every stage he stepped on. But behind that image was someone who was growing increasingly tired. The demands never slowed down, the expectations never lowered, and the need to keep going never disappeared. Lisa Marie began to understand that her father wasn't just performing for the world, he was trying to live up to an identity that had taken on a life of its own. And the more he tried to meet those expectations, the more he seemed to lose parts of himself in the process. There were moments that stayed with her, moments that didn't make headlines but spoke volumes about what he was going through. Quiet evenings, distant expressions, a sense of something unspoken lingering in the air. These weren't the moments fans saw. but they were the moments that defined the truth of his life. Lisa Marie carried those memories with her, even as the world continued to celebrate a version of Elvis that felt incomplete. What made her revelations so impactful was not just what she said, but how she said it. There was no bitterness in her words, no attempt to diminish his legacy. Instead, there was honesty, raw, emotional, and deeply personal. She wanted people to understand that loving Elvis Presley didn't mean ignoring his struggles. It meant acknowledging them, learning from them, and seeing him as more than just an icon. She spoke about the importance of recognizing the human side of greatness, the part that often gets lost in the spotlight. Because when people only focus on perfection, they miss the reality that makes someone truly relatable. Through her perspective, the world began to see a different side of Elvis. Not a weaker version, but a more complete one. A man who achieved extraordinary success while quietly battling extraordinary pressure. A father who loved deeply, but struggled to balance that love with the demands of fame. A human being who gave everything he had, even when it cost him more than anyone realized. And as those truths came to light, they changed the way people understood his story. It was no longer just about the music, the fame, or the legend. It was about the person behind it all. The part of his life that had been overlooked for so long finally had a voice. And that voice belonged to the one person who saw it all, not from the outside looking in, but from within the walls that held both the magic and the pain. By the time Elvis Presley reached the height of his fame, the world had already decided who he was supposed to be, and there was no turning back. The image of the king had become larger than the man himself. Every performance, every public appearance, every moment in front of a camera reinforced that identity. But behind that powerful image, something far more fragile was taking shape. The pressure wasn't just external anymore, it had become internal. He wasn't only performing for the world, he was performing for the version of himself that the world demanded. For Lisa Marie Presley, this was one of the most painful realities to witness. As she grew older, she began to understand that her father wasn't just trapped by fame. He was shaped by it in ways that were difficult to escape. The expectations placed on him didn't fade when the music stopped. They followed him into every room, every conversation, every quiet moment. It became harder and harder for him to separate who he truly was from who he needed to be. That kind of pressure doesn't disappear overnight. It builds, slowly and silently, until it begins to affect everything. Lisa Marie would later reflect on how this constant tension created a sense of restlessness in him. There were moments when he seemed unable to relax, as if he were always searching for something he couldn't quite find. Even in stillness, there was unease. Even in success, there was something missing. The world believed he had everything, but from her perspective, it often felt like he was chasing a sense of peace that stayed just out of reach. And the more he chased it, the more distant it seemed to become. One of the most striking things she noticed was how deeply he felt everything. Elvis wasn't just a performer. He was an emotional person who carried the weight of his experiences intensely. That emotional depth was part of what made his music so powerful, but it was also part of what made his struggles more difficult. He didn't just experience pressure, he absorbed it. He didn't just hear the noise of the world, he felt it. And over time, that emotional intensity began to take its toll. Lisa Marie saw how those emotions sometimes overwhelmed him, how they created moments of vulnerability that the public never saw. These weren't the dramatic, headline-making moments. They were quieter, more personal, but no less significant. They were the kind of moments that reveal the truth about a person's inner world. And for Elvis, that inner world was far more complex than anyone outside could have imagined. As the gap between his public life and private reality continued to grow, it became harder for him to find balance. The stage gave him energy, purpose, and connection, but it also demanded everything from him. Off the stage, there was a struggle to reconnect with himself, to find a sense of normalcy that fame had taken away. Lisa Marie would later describe how this imbalance affected not just him, but everyone around him. When someone is constantly pulled in different directions, it becomes difficult to maintain stability in relationships, in routines, in everyday life. And for a child trying to understand her father, that instability could be confusing and at times painful. She remembered wanting simple things: time, attention, moments of connection that felt real and uninterrupted. And while there were times when he gave her that, there were also times when the demands of his life took him away, even when he was physically present. That was one of the hardest things to understand, how someone could be there, yet feel so far away. But perhaps the most revealing part of Lisa Marie's perspective was how she described the emotional isolation he experienced. Fame surrounded him with people, but it didn't always provide genuine understanding. There's a difference between being admired and being truly known, and Elvis often existed in that gap. The world knew his voice, his style, his performances, but very few people truly knew him as a person. And that kind of isolation can be one of the most difficult things to carry, especially when it's hidden behind constant attention and praise. Lisa Marie's revelations brought that reality into focus. She didn't just talk about what people missed, she showed why they missed it. The image of Elvis was so powerful, so deeply ingrained in culture, that it left little room for anything else. People didn't ignore his struggles because they didn't care. They ignored them because they didn't fit the story they wanted to believe. And changing that story meant confronting a truth that was uncomfortable but necessary. Through her words, the narrative began to shift. Elvis Presley was no longer seen only as a symbol of perfection, but as a human being, navigating an extraordinary life with very real challenges. That shift didn't diminish his legacy, it added depth to it. It made his achievements even more remarkable, not less. Because when you understand what someone carried behind the scenes, their strength becomes more meaningful. Their success becomes more than just talent, it becomes resilience. And in that realization, something powerful happened. The world began to see not just what Elvis gave, but what it cost him to give it. They began to understand that the man they worshipped wasn't untouched by struggle, he was shaped by it. And perhaps, for the first time, they started to truly see him, not just as the king, but as a person who lived, felt, and endured far more than anyone ever realized. As the years moved forward, the contrast between the public image of Elvis Presley and his private reality became impossible to ignore, at least for those closest to him. To the outside world, he was still the king, still the electrifying performer who could command a stage like no one else. Crowds continued to cheer, fans continued to believe, and the legend continued to grow. But behind that legend, the weight he carried had become heavier than ever. And for Lisa Marie Presley, this period revealed some of the most difficult truths about her father's life. As she matured, her understanding deepened. The confusion she felt as a child slowly turned into clarity. She began to see patterns, to connect moments, to recognize that what she had witnessed over the years wasn't just random. It was the result of a life lived under constant pressure. The signs had always been there, but now they made sense. The emotional distance, the restlessness, the quiet struggles, they were all part of a larger reality that the world had chosen not to see. One of the most powerful realizations she shared was how much of his life was shaped by expectation rather than choice. When you become a global icon, your identity is no longer entirely your own. Every decision is influenced by what people expect, what they want, what they believe you should be. For Elvis, that meant living in a way that constantly reinforced the image of perfection, even when he didn't feel it inside. And over time, that kind of life can create a deep sense of disconnection from others and even from yourself. Lisa Marie saw how this disconnection affected him on a daily basis. There were moments when he seemed present, engaged, even joyful, but those moments often felt temporary, like brief pauses in an ongoing struggle. Beneath them, there was always something unresolved, something unspoken. It wasn't always visible, and it wasn't always easy to explain, but it was there, and the longer it remained unaddressed, the more it seemed to grow. What made this period even more complex was the way the world continued to respond to him. The admiration never faded. If anything, it intensified. The bigger the crowds became, the louder the applause grew, the stronger the belief in his perfection became. But that belief created a kind of barrier, one that made it even harder for people to accept that he might be struggling. After all, how could someone so loved, so successful, so admired, possibly be facing difficulties? That question alone prevented many from seeing the truth that was right in front of them. Lisa Marie's perspective challenged that assumption in a deeply personal way. She spoke about the importance of looking beyond the surface, of understanding that success and happiness are not always the same thing. Just because someone appears to have everything doesn't mean they feel complete. Just because someone is constantly surrounded by people doesn't mean they aren't lonely. These were lessons she learned not from theory, but from experience, from watching her father navigate a life that was as demanding as it was extraordinary. She also reflected on how difficult it was for him to break free from the cycle he was in. When your entire identity is built around a certain image, stepping away from it can feel impossible. There's a fear of disappointing people, of losing what you've built, of no longer being who the world expects you to be. For Elvis, that fear was very real. And so instead of stepping away, he continued to push forward, even when it came at a personal cost. That decision to keep going, to keep performing, to keep living up to the legend was one that defined much of his later life. And while it brought continued success, it also deepened the challenges he was already facing. Lisa Marie's words didn't come from a place of judgment, but from a place of understanding. She didn't see her father as someone who made mistakes. She saw him as someone who was trying to navigate an incredibly complex life with the tools he had. She recognized his strength, his dedication, and his love, even in the midst of his struggles. And that balanced perspective made her revelations even more powerful. She wasn't trying to rewrite his story. She was trying to complete it. What the world had missed wasn't just the difficulty of his journey, but the humanity within it. They had seen the performances, heard the music, celebrated the success, but they hadn't fully understood the person behind it all. Lisa Marie gave that person a voice. She brought attention to the parts of his life that had been overlooked, not to change how people felt about him, but to deepen that understanding. And as more people began to listen, the narrative continued to evolve. Elvis Presley was no longer just an untouchable icon. He was a symbol of both greatness and vulnerability. A reminder that even those who seem larger than life are still shaped by the same emotions, the same struggles, and the same need for connection as everyone else. This realization didn't take anything away from his legacy. Instead, it added something essential to it: truth. And in that truth, there was a new kind of respect, not just for what he achieved, but for what he endured. Not just for the legend he became, but for the man he always was beneath it. In the end, the story of Elvis Presley is not just about fame, music, or the title of the king. It is about something far deeper, something the world only began to understand through the voice of Lisa Marie Presley. For decades, people believed they knew everything about him. They watched his performances, followed his life, and built an image so powerful that it became almost impossible to question. But as Lisa Marie shared her truth, that image began to shift, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that finally made him whole. She revealed that what people missed wasn't just the struggle, it was the humanity behind the legend. The world had focused so much on what Elvis represented that they forgot to see who he really was. And in doing so, she didn't just tell her father's story, she changed the way people understood it. As fans began to reflect on her words, something remarkable happened. The admiration they felt didn't fade, it deepened. Because now, they weren't just admiring a legend, they were connecting with a human being. They began to see the courage it took for him to keep going, to keep performing, to keep giving so much of himself, even when it wasn't easy. They began to appreciate not just the outcome of his life, but the journey behind it, the sacrifices, the challenges, the moments of quiet struggle that never made headlines, but defined so much of who he was. Lisa Marie's voice became a bridge between the myth and the man. Through her, people could finally see both sides, the public figure they had always loved, and the private individual they had never fully known. And that connection created a new kind of legacy, one that wasn't based on perfection, but on authenticity, one that acknowledged both the highs and the lows, the triumphs and the struggles, one that felt real. In many ways, her revelations also served as a reminder. A reminder that no matter how successful someone appears, they're still human. That behind every image, every reputation, every story told to the world, there is a deeper reality that deserves to be seen and understood. It encouraged people to look beyond the surface, to ask questions, to care not just about what they see, but about what might be hidden beneath it. And that message extended far beyond Elvis himself. It became something universal, something that could be applied to anyone living under pressure, anyone trying to meet expectations, anyone struggling to balance who they are with who the world expects them to be. As the years passed, the legacy of Elvis Presley continued to evolve. His music remained timeless, his influence undeniable, his impact lasting across generations. But thanks to Lisa Marie, that legacy gained something even more valuable: depth. It became a story not just of success, but of resilience, not just of fame, but of humanity. And in that deeper understanding, there was a kind of closure, not just for fans, but for the story itself. Because now, it wasn't incomplete anymore. The missing pieces had been revealed, the silent truths had been spoken, and the man behind the legend had finally been seen. In the end, the world may have worshipped Elvis, but it was his daughter who helped them understand him, and that understanding didn't weaken his legacy, it made it unforgettable.